Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of the coolabah tree. As he sat as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Leaks at the Crossroads. We're going to continue on with our discussion, the individual, policy and administration. And we have from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hello, Arnie. I'm pleased to be here.
And from Adelaide, Betty Lukes. Welcome, Betty Lukes.
Thank you, Arnie. Good morning.
Okay. Now, policy and administration in regard to the individual. In Adelaide, we have a building code, a new building code that's actually filtered down from the United Nations. And it's called the medium density housing. It's being implemented by our councils under the guidance of the state government. And medium density housing is high rise. In Australia, there's no shortage of land. In actual fact, if we said there's probably one person for every half a square kilometre. That's how big our nation is, and that's how lightly or sparsely populated it is. Now, most of the population is concentrated on the eastern seaboard, certainly on the coasts, and the weather's varied across our continent from scorching deserts to lush tropical paradises. But the point is that in amongst all of that variance of environmental conditions, this medium density housing is placing high rises on our in our cities, and it's increasing the congestion in the cities. There's no upgrades of infrastructure, roads, sewers, water, telecommunications, power. There's no upgrades unless it's absolutely vital, and yet the population density is increasing in orders of magnitude. Now that's administration, that's a policy coming down from United Nations, medium density housing. As I said, administered by local council. The community hasn't asked for it. Now the ramifications of it are that the cost of housing for this generation, now I say this generation, under 30s, the cost of housing is basically tripled. And the income, job security, again, administrative policy. Job security. Our industries in Adelaide are being shut down progressively. We've lost 2 car manufacturers, steelworks, shipbuilding, white goods, and all the ancillary industries that go with it. All of this income that was coming to, or the potential that would have been coming to, had those industries still been here, that income would have assured or given an assurance to the younger generation that they've got a future, that they can work in this industry, they can plan, they can save, they can do without for a better future. And these outcomes, the consequence of policy, is affecting them to the point where they don't have a tenure of long-term employment. In actual fact, they're lucky if they can get a 12-month contract. And so you've got to consider, were they actually engaged in this policy? Were they engaged in the development of it? Was there consultation? Was there actually agreement to the ramifications, that how it would affect them? And it's absolutely hugely profound that there's a between one generation and the next, a policy coming from an administration, from the bureaucrats in charge, far enough up the food chain that they don't actually see the effect, or if they do, they're indifferent to the effect on individuals. And I think it's atrocious. And the fact is, when we talk about individuals, policy and administration, we've got to come back to, what do we actually believe? What do we believe? Where philosophy is so vital. Is the individual free, or is the individual just some type of human sausage that's processed through the bureaucracy? So I'm going to open the floor up to Wallace to bring us into this subject.
Well, you're talking about the concentration of population and being driven, obviously, by the the factor of cost. They're trying to minimize cost, but at the same time, the policy, as you say, is being increasingly coming directed from a more distant source. In this case, you say the United Nations. Policy should be as enacted as closely to the people as is practically possible. And under the present circumstances, it is being directed in a manner that is removed from the people far too much, and increasingly so, unfortunately, because of the financial pressures that are brought upon the community and the individual.
Thanks, Wallace. That's right. The yeah, this is actually coming from the top down, and so we've got to consider, if we're going to look at society and how it functions and how it works, we've got to consider the ramifications of how society is structured. And I know Australia has a wonderful history of having worked this through before. 1901, year of federation. Australia took 10 years to come to agreement, but it got there. Betty.
Yes. Well, of course, what we're looking at is the difference between two basic philosophies. And the one is the philosophy of a freedom-loving people who seek policies and administration that are going to ensure that what they want to see happen does happen. And the other is that where the policies and direction comes from the top, as in a pyramid association, a pyramid diagram. And we're human beings, and we've always lived in some sort of association. And these are not matters that have not been looked at before and have been studied before. And I think that we have to go back to looking at them again.
Thank you, Betty.
One is for freedom and one is for centralisation.
That's it. That's exactly right. Thank you, Betty. That's right. One is for freedom and one is not. And Wallace, keep going.
Well, of course, there's different types of freedom. Economic freedom is the primary one. That is the one that is closest to human survival. And then there's political freedom, which is the ability to direct representatives to enact programs which are beneficial to the community. I'm not sure exactly. You know, we associate as human beings to achieve what we cannot achieve individually. And that's what brings us together in joint activity. The problem is we want to make sure that our activity is actually giving results which do redound to the benefit and satisfaction of the individual. And so that initiative must stem from the community, especially on broad policy levels, broad policy questions. The actual way in which policy is to be achieved or enacted through administration has to be done in a more pyramidal form of organization. In other words, you cannot have policy being enacted or realized by a lot of non-experts. You have to have experts. There's nobody who's going to buy a car who wants a car that was built by the community. You want a car that is built by a group of people who are experts in the field and know what they're doing and are going to deliver results.
Thank you, Wallace. That's exactly right. The difference between policy and administration, and that is that the community or group of individuals can come together and suggest or recommend, this is the policy we're after. We're actually attempting to derive benefit by this policy, and then you've got to hand it over. You've got to hand it over to the administration to process that policy to conclusion so that they can be held accountable for the results. And if you can't hold them accountable, then your system is not working correctly. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing policy coming down from higher authorities, and they're certainly not accountable. In actual fact, they're insisting that they have the divine right of kings. They're not accountable at all. And I think we need to keep this clearly in our mind. Betty Luke.
Well, that just reminds me of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Constitution, and I like to call it the Commonwealth of Australia because the word wealth to me means well-being, the common well-being of the people of Australia. That's how I think of it. And it begins with the words, whereas the people of the various states, and at that stage they were states, under the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite. The people have agreed to unite, not governments, not bureaucrats, but the people agreed to unite. And so they worked out their constitution and they agreed at a referendum to that constitution. And it's important to realize that the constitutional development was rooted in the British experiences of over 1,000 years of squabbling and tribalism, all of that, until finally they became the United Kingdom. I do accept that we have lost our way as far as that goes now, and we've got to find our way back again. But the idea was that it was a decentralized power, and as much as possible, it was decentralized back to local governments. That was the basic foundation, and it was essential for a free society and the individuals who form that society.
Thanks, Betty. I think that's very important that we look at. It took, I said earlier on, 10 years to discuss, negotiate, and argue out our constitution. At least 10 years, and I think that's vitally important that we consider that this was not a fly-by-night decision. This was painfully worked through, and I know that the history of common law we inherited as a legacy from the British Isles, the principle of common law that was always based on litigation between peoples, and how they worked it out, and how the judges slowly and painfully worked this out in the courts. Okay, we've got to form agreement. How are we going to do it? And it didn't come easy. It certainly wasn't arbitrarily decided, but it was worked through, and that's people with perseverance and tenacity who work these things through. And this is where we've got to come from. We've got to reconsider what are our objectives. What do we actually want? Do we want to live like chooks in batteries? Because that's what the United Nations is giving it. Is this really what we want? Do we want it that we never own our own home? That the levels of debt are so astronomical, and our precarious position of tenure of employment is such that we have no chance of securing a future? These are outworking of policies, and if these are our objectives, that's fine, but I don't believe for a second they are. Wallace, Klinck.
Well, accountability is the key thing here. Accountability has to apply in administration. Otherwise, there can be no successful execution of a program. Accountability from the general public is a different thing. That is accountability with respect to the carrying out of policy. And the really critical aspect of enforcing accountability is the right to contract out. If you're working for an organization that you don't think is doing the right thing, you should have the right to contract out. But the public also should be able to contract out of supporting any representative who is not conscientiously working toward the ends which are beneficial to the community and the individuals within the community. So accountability works in administration, and accountability works in the democratic process. It's absolutely important, because if people can, as Betty said, the divine right of kings, where there is no accountability or responsibility, that is arbitrary power gone rampant, and it will wreak havoc amongst society. You can't have that kind of thing going on, because the individual is the really basic building block of society, and the object should always be maximum satisfaction for the individual.
Thanks, Wallace. I noted then that you talked about the representative, but you also mentioned the bureaucrat. And I think that at some later stage we will talk about citizens' initiative, referendum and recall. It's a political legal mechanism whereby if your representative is out of order, if your bureaucrat is out of order, if they're actually achieving things that you don't want, and they're driving these things, then you've got to consider, well, how can we actually evolve and implement a system where we can make these people accountable? Because as we lose our freedoms more and more, then the bureaucracy becomes more and more totalitarian. The politicians become less and less concerned about your well-being and more about manipulating the electorate to achieve their targets. So these things are most important, and we've got to put them on the table and discuss them and look vigorously at them over an extended period of time until we can come to resolution. Betty Luke's.
Talking of accountability, I have to admit I haven't followed up the issue, but I've seen references to it in the media about it's called Oakden. I understand it to be a nursing home in the hills that surround Adelaide, and the standard of care of the old people has been an absolute disgrace. Now, it ends up that there is a minister who is the final person to be responsible for that. And of course they're calling for his sacking because he has been irresponsible. And it seems to me there's a very good example of, we've just had International Women's Day, and I think about, what about having local Women's Day? What about having Primary Care for Local People Day rather than International Women's Day? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything that the bureaucrats over there in the United Nations live it up very well, and you have old people here in South Australia who are not receiving the duty of care that is their right.
Thank you, Betty. That's exactly right. Accountability, policy and administration, and accountability. And we've got to consider these weighty matters. And it comes back to, it ultimately comes back to, what do you believe? What do you believe? Do you believe that old person is a unique human being and deserving of respect? And if they are, then they should be treated in that fashion. And the fact is, if you're indifferent to them, one day you might be that old person. And how will it be then? Wallace Klinck.
Well, just as an aside, I understand that International Women's Day was actually initiated by Madame Kalantay, who was a radical communist, who I think was quite dedicated to the elimination of the family, as I understand it, elimination of the family as an institution in society. However, on the larger scale, I just lost my.
It's okay. I'll break out. It's happening to us all at times because we're going deep and we're thinking on our feet. This is the thing. We're thinking on our feet as we go. This isn't choreographed. This isn't scripted. We have a preliminary discussion before the recording, and then we move into the deep end and we wrestle with these weighty matters. And that's why you're getting it the way it is. This is what's in all the recording. It's Ycast, it's streaming, and I think if you recognise that this is not for entertainment. This is for the student who's interested in trying to find his way through this maze. Why are we discussing what we're discussing? Because we've gone the wrong way. That's right, we've gone the wrong way. Are you ready, Molly?
Certainly have gone the wrong way. The problem is that all decisions are based upon basically the idea of providing a level of economic security for people, but unfortunately it's based upon the idea of what people are entitled to by what they do in the way of labor or work, which does not take into consideration the vast role of nature and technology in the actual production of wealth. And so that we build up bureaucracies and so on, which become well, they become an enterprise of their own. They go beyond their legitimate function. They become a monstrous sort of means of directing society rather than helping society to achieve what it's functionally, naturally capable of doing. And so that we end up with tyrannical institutions. And that is the problem. It's basically that mankind has an inheritance in the nature of things. That inheritance is blocked. There's a bottleneck that prevents that inheritance from being realized. And so therefore, we are required to serve some function in order to justify our existence. And the direction of that comes from above. It isn't a natural thing. It's something that comes from above, and it results in tyrannical organization or bureaucratic organization because they see their function as to direct society rather than to let society evolve.
Thanks, Wally. I'm reminded by what you just said of our Chief Executive Officer of Qantas, the major airline carrier in Australia. And he's taken it, him and the fellows in charge of it, have taken it upon themselves that they will change language within their organisation. And I find that fascinating. How could they even be so impertinent to think that they have a right to change language within their organisation? And they're removing this whole thing about gender identity and mankind. You get to change all this. And of course it becomes corporate fascism. And when you see it to the point where if you don't fit into their organisation in the way they think and the way that they want you to think, your security, your long-term employment security is certainly threatened. And the viability of keeping your own home and keeping your family together is threatened. And I find that fascinating that there it is, they're so far out of this, out of reality, that they're going to arbitrarily impose their point of view on everyone within their organisation as to how you think. Because the fact is, if you have to use certain words in a certain fashion and your job is threatened, if you don't do that, then your security is seriously challenged. Now, I'm not convinced that I've got a strong connection with Betty, so I'm going to go back to Wallace.
Yes, there's no doubt about that, Arnie. It's again, it is work-related. It is because people do not have an independence of economic security, and this simply makes them slaves to the system. It's everything is directed to the idea of income that is earned, and I think Douglas really perceived the essential nature of the situation when he said that it is quite obvious that there is a concerted effort to make independent income a smaller factor in the life of the individual, and to make earned income, no matter what type of earned income, just some kind of earned income, regardless of its actual validity or use to mankind, the basis of income. Of course, that means that whoever is controlling those activities controls the individuals who are involved, and it leads to a virtual full employment slave state.
Thanks, Wallace. That's right. We're seeing it here. We're seeing it with what we call 18C, which is the race or sexual harassment or whatever it is in Australia, and the C16 in Canada, which is your genderism and gender identity laws. And it gets to the point where people can't have open dialogue without fear or threat of offending someone. And of course, with that offence or potential for offence, you get to the point where you can't communicate. You can't honestly talk to someone and treat them as that unique human being. And this is where it comes down to philosophy. Are we just in this group or that group? Not at all. Not at all. I've got friends of varying persuasions and colours and creeds, and they're beautiful, they're unique, they're special people, and they're certainly not part of part of any group in the sense that if they do come together to play cricket, that's fine. But are they black, white or brindle? I don't care. It's who they are as a person. And I can name them, I won't. But we've played footy, my brother's played footy with them. We've been friends with them for years. My children have married them, come on. It's all part of it. We're good friends, and we're all in this together. This social arrangement. We're all in this together. We the people. We're in this together. They're not in groups, but it's coming together one at a time. Wallace.
Well, of course, there's no doubt about it that the so-called gender war, or whatever you wish to describe it, it stems from the idea of full employment and the necessity to have opportunities within the economy to be employed without undue or unfair treatment. And it comes from the denial of that inheritance, because people are forced to serve under someone else's authority and direction. And there's no doubt about it. In the past, there have been many occasions where people have exercised their authority in an unfair and exploitative manner. But again, that's where the individual is not sufficiently economically independent that they can say, look, I don't really like you very much, and I certainly don't like your policies or your behavior, so goodbye. I'm gone. Because you have to live, you have to eat, you have to have a roof over your head, your family has to survive. And so people do all sorts of things today that are humiliating, that are immoral and wrong and unethical, and it has degraded. This worship of work has degraded the whole moral and ethical basis of civilization.
That's right. Thank you for that, Wally. We're having problems with Betty's video transmission. We'll pick her up when she's on the screen again. I worked for 24 and a half years for a company, an oil company, major oil company, Mobil Oil Australia. And then 11 years I worked for Santos, which was a gas company, gas and oil in the Klinck Basin, Central Australia. And I can describe them, honestly, and it's not a bias here, I can describe them as benevolent companies. Now, in the early days of Mobil, I was only a young lad, they insisted that I contribute for my retirement security, superannuation. They insisted, this is their policy. You've got to do it, we want you to do it, and I'm very pleased that I did do it, because it's guaranteed a future for me that could have been a lot more precarious had I not done that. Now, they looked after me, and I say that honestly, that they looked after my well-being. Even their engagement with my younger days were full of exuberance and not necessarily a lot of wisdom. They calmed me down and pointed me in the right direction, and they gave me job security, trained me, developed me, and I continued to advance myself through night schools and things like that, and progressed through the structure. It was quite an enjoyable time. In actual fact, I can only say that I loved the job. 35 plus years I was in the oil and gas industry, and I loved it. I loved being creative, innovative, and I was given the opportunity to develop myself. Now, there was a corporate takeover just near the end of Mobil by another company, Exxon, and I did notice a completely different philosophy coming from Exxon, and certainly from Mobil once it was taken over by Exxon. And that was one of autocracy. I'm pretty sure I got the right word. It's essentially from the top down, totally autocratic, and the fact is the feedback going from the floor back up to the managers and that was stunted, because people were concerned about their viability, their future, their employment, and so the two-way street was actually lost, I believe, to the detriment of that company. Now, when I went to Santos, it was again the same. It was the management were prepared to engage, and on the basis that they engaged, I believe we had a good working relationship. It was honest, and it was vital, and it was at times it was tough. I have no issue with tough. I think tough is good. I'm happy with tough. If the bosses are tough with me, okay, take it on the chin. I'll take it as it comes, as long as they're honest. And so they gave me honest, and we got on. And so I respected that company as well, and it was a pleasure. But once you move to the point where my family's income is insecure, my future, my home is insecure, based on words that I use at work. They have no right to get into my head. They have no right to insist that this is the way I will think. I'm a free human being. And that to me is fascism. And okay, CEO of Qantas is leading the way. I don't agree with it. We've got Betty back. Betty.
Yes, thank you. I didn't do anything. The technology did it all itself. Well, of course, you're talking about what Jordan Peterson spoke about when he spoke to that cat in Newman. Why did he take the stand he did? Because he in order to think and speak, he has to. Any human being has to when it comes to this politically correct speech, and that in itself is a fascinating subject. It's not for today, but it is a fascinating subject. And I want to go back to my experiences that as I sought to learn these things, which is many years ago, it was Eric Butler who pointed out the importance of seeing the road rules as a good example for law. Law shouldn't be such a draconian weight on our shoulders. The road rules give a very good example that in a free society, the rules are devised that all may travel on the roads and by obeying the rules. And it's not only me in my old jalopy, but it's also the governor of the state in his Rolls Royce. We can both share the roads and go from A to B wherever we want to publicly, and all have that freedom. But once you start to put up barriers that you can't go on that road or this road or whatever, then you're being dictated to, and that to me is the important point.
Thanks, Betty. That's right. It gets to the point where the political mechanisms that we have are pushing out laws like sausages, and it stifles you, it straitjackets you. Whereas in actual fact, as a community, as a society, what we need to do is review and go back and have a look and say, okay, we've taken the wrong turn. We don't want fascism. We don't want corporate fascism. We don't want a communist state. We don't want a dictatorship. What we want is we want freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to speak. I was reading a document just this morning by the IPA, Institute of Public Affairs, why 18C, which is the Racial Discrimination Act, why 18C should be completely removed from our statute books, so that we are free to discuss, to think, and if it is that someone is offended, so be it, because the freedom is more important, it is more weighty to get to the truth of the situation than it is that someone takes offence. And we've got to consider that freedom is the goal within responsibility. It doesn't mean that you can attack someone or denigrate them or whatever, but you've got to discuss your subject openly and honestly. I'm going to give it to... I saw your hand, Eddie, but I'm going to give it to Wallace.
Well, absolutely. Discrimination is the basis of all intelligent action. And the problem is that the system under which we live, of finance capitalism, under the banking system that we have, defective as it is, it removes economic security from people. So the people who are concerned about that, quite naturally, will say, well, freedom is not an answer to the problem. You have to have laws and regulations so that there is justice, there is fairness, there is justice. But it's the problem that the problem is that the financial system is a bottleneck, and the bottleneck is in consumption, not in production. Production will respond to expressed consumer demand. It'll respond very well. Production is not our big problem. It's consumption, distribution and consumption. And so we have to solve that problem and make the financial system capable of doing that. Now, you mentioned pensions. Now, pensions actually involve savings. Now, if you save money that you've earned, those savings have been a cost of production. And if you save them, they're not being used to cancel those costs of production. That's a problem. If you invest that money, and that's what is done with money that goes into pension funds, you're creating new wealth with new and additional costs and prices, while those original ones still are not liquidated. So what it means is you have to keep producing more and more and more and more in order to try to fill this gap, which is just a monetary, a gap that results because of accounting conventions. So what we should have is a system where the system is dynamic, where goods and services flow dynamically, automatically to the public, so that the public always has the access to them as a whole. We shouldn't have to be drawing on our future. We can only live from what we have now, and we should make our financial accountancy system reflect that.
Thanks, Wallace. That's a very important point. I know we touched on, actually we did, we had an entire session on money creation in the modern economy. And where Wallace is talking today is about is balancing the financial system with the economic system. Social credit, Douglas presented the proposal more than 100 years ago. And the A plus B theory, which highlights that there's always a shortage of spending power. Now, by me putting my money away into the pension fund, that means that the wages that are paid out to me are not being put back in the system. And if you look at the economy as a whole, you say, right, there's the economy and there's the financial system, and I'll slip this away, I'll put this into the piggy bank. And if they were balanced, which they're not, that means that for all savings, the economy can't actually be liquidated, can't be purchased. And that was if you believe in the balance. I don't believe in the balance because no industry that I'm aware of ever has wages and production as balanced. They never do. Wages only ever make up a component of production. And so you look at this imbalance even further. That's why the progressive debt, look at all the debt clocks, every nation in the world progressively getting further and further in debt. And so yes, policy, administration, philosophy, you can see how these are all tied up. And yes, the tool being used to control us is finance. Betty Lukes. Hang on, Wally. Sorry, I've just... Betty Lukes.
Well, my thoughts go back to Jordan Peterson on this, and I have to say that I have a great respect for what the man is trying to do, but I would be a little bit concerned as to the direction that some people might want to take him. I'm reminded how he pointed out in one of his videos of the sign above the Auschwitz labour camp that work will set you free, and that he saw that as wrong, and he saw how it was used to oppress the inmates and all of that, but I'm not sure that he has looked at the implications of what has happened since then. History is not static. It doesn't stop still. And I'm not sure that he has thought about how communism rose to the fore as it did, who were the financiers who financed communism, and just how are we going to get this side of the battle through to the young people? As an example, there's no problem looking at the Fabian socialists in this country. In fact, you can go to the Fabian Socialists the Fabians website, and they'll list some of their members. And for instance, you've got three former prime ministers, Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, and who's the other one I'm thinking of? It'll come to me in a minute. You've got Bill Shorten. He's now the opposition leader, and he's being promoted as the next prime minister. If you want to look to understand what Fabian socialism is all about, you need to look at our little book. It's on our website, called The Great Liberal Death Wish by Malcolm Muggeridge.
Thanks, Betty. And that's interesting where you've taken us. You've highlighted Fabian socialism. What our listeners may not be apparent to you, before I get back to you, Wallace, it may not be apparent to you that capitalism as such is exploitive. I'm not talking about free enterprise. Let's be very specific about this, very clear. Free enterprise is one thing. The individual taking initiative, entrepreneurial, creative, go out there, do it. But when you go for monopoly capitalism, and it's exploitive, and they're quite happy to go to third world slave camps and use these sweat factories to produce their goods and then sell them for $1,000 so you can hang off your ear and all this sort of stuff. It's this is just inconsistent. It's they're exploitive like anything, and it's all to do with money. It's all to do with power. It's all to do with profit. I'm not suggesting that profit is evil, but disproportionate profit. These people this is something that we've got to work through in our thinking. That free enterprise, okay. Corporatized monopoly capitalism, not. Wallace.
Well, it's like a malignant tumor. I mean, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it grows until it destroys the host. And the only problem is Fabian socialism is a bureaucratic administration of society. That's what it is fundamentally. But it has worked in hand with the financial system because the centralized power that is associated with that type of bureaucratic administration is what the financial system has brought on by putting a stricture in the price system, which makes it more and more difficult for the smaller units to survive. And it becomes sort of a system where the bigger units are always taking over the others. Actually, a banker once told me that over 90% of businesses actually fail. It's not that, I agree with you, private business is the only way to go. Certainly it is. On a genuine freedom, in the sense of genuinely freedom as it means exercise of initiative and creativity. But what the system is a power system. It's not just a production and consumption system. It is a system that is designed to centralize economic and political power. That's the problem. And it leads more and more to a focus, or to a locus of power, which is world government in its ultimate form.
Thanks, Wallace. That's right. The Fabian socialists are in there. The ultra capitalists are in there. They're all the same. They're all in it together for world government. Betty Lukes.
Yes, this to me is an important point that I'm not sure that ones like Jordan Peterson have grasped as yet. It was just in the news recently that Alexander Downer, who was a former Liberal member here in South Australia, and he's now, I think it's High Commissioner in London, and living the good life, and he had something to say about a Soviet spy. I'm not sure exactly what it is because there's that much news to catch up with, but the point is this, that what many people don't recognize is that what I call international socialists took over the conservative movements and institutions many years ago. And if we want to look at some of them, you've got in America, it's the Council of Foreign Relations. In Australia, it's the Australian Institute for International Affairs. There's the Royal Institute for International Affairs in Britain, and I was reminded of this because Alexander Downer was part of the Australian Institute of International Affairs while he was still in Parliament. Things like this. Now, our present Prime Minister is supposed to be a conservative, and yet he's hanging on to that hate speech law with both hands. He has no intention of freeing the people to say what they think.
Thanks, Betty. That's right. Former merchant banker, our Prime Minister, and he's implementing as many socialist policies as he possibly can into Australia. And the fact is that these centralising policies, which are removing our freedoms, is in the middle of it. So don't tell me you can't see it. If you just take long enough to have a look and you realise, well, hang on, he's a banker. He's supposed to be an ultra-capitalist. Why is he tied in with all this communist legalism? Why is he doing it? Because they're consistent. They're consistent. They're all about power and power over the individual. Wally Klinck.
Well, yes, the socialist movements or revolutions have virtually always historically been supported by the financial institutions because they both have, as you say, the common objective of centralized power. The financial system is not, as it should be, merely a reflection of what we as free beings do. It is a mechanism that does not properly reflect and increasingly distorts what we actually do. So we're actually, and as a matter of fact, the financial system works against the productive system, the efficiency of the system, because the more efficient you get, the more costs and prices you're creating relative to the incomes that you're distributing. So, and that means that you have to go back begging for more and more loans from the banks. So it's a thing that just feeds on itself, and it gets bigger and bigger and more consuming all the time, more domineering over society.
Thanks, Wally. Anyone who cares to look at the debt clocks, I've said it before, I'll say it again, go to the debt clocks and have a look at it. How come you've got the most productive nation in the world, the history of the world? No nation has produced more. No nation has basically achieved more materially. And yet its level of debt is irredeemable. It's in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's got to the point where it's just, the numbers are so long. They go from here to the moon, dollar bills and things like that. It's just, this is crazy. This is crazy. How can it be in debt when it's just producing? And 50% of its current production is in arms. This is why, because it's forced to chase the never-ending dollar. And it's how can we be in so much debt? How can America be in so much debt when it produces so much? It doesn't make sense unless you recognise that its insufficient purchasing power goes out with every item it produces, whether it's a coffee cup or it's a bullet. It still doesn't have enough money to buy it. And so if it turned to coffee cups and threw them on the ground and smashed them, that would be more productive than be a bullet that kills someone. Betty Lukes.
Well, that's exactly right, Arnie. And that to me is the question that I think that men like Jordan Peterson have got to look at. Why is it? He talks about the elimination of malaria and the feeding of the masses of people in comparison with say 100 years ago. That's fine, but unless he looks at this other side of the coin, he hasn't got the full picture. And my concern would be that he's so busy involved with the meetings that he needs to look at who is directing him. He might do better to stop the meetings for a while and stop and think about what else he needs to know.
Thanks, Betty. That's a big call to challenge that man, but the fact is that there are others out there looking at what he's saying. And if he's got the media platform, and he has, major newspapers are covering, radio stations are covering him, the internet's gone berserk, over 8 million hits on that Kathy Newman video, 8 million hits. I mean, it's being promoted. He's being promoted. This is Google not censoring him. They're letting him loose. Make a noise about it, whatever. But the fact is, the search engines are bringing him up. You just have to look at it. And if that's the case, then you say, okay, Peterson, are you a man for the people, or are you actually got handlers around you? That's a big call. It's a big call. Wallace Klinck.
Well, there will always be people that try to be handlers of anyone who stands up for genuine reforms, which are going to, benefit the people at large. No, I agree with you, Betty. He has mentioned the so-called enormous productivity that we've developed, which is entirely true, but he did not, at least not where I was observing, mention the enormous debt overhang that is a claim against all of that. I mean, debt is a claim against wealth. When the banks hold enormous debts against the community, they have the potential to literally foreclose on the community. In other words, what they've done, they have appropriated the communal capital just as the communists would have done, except that they're doing it surreptitiously through financial means instead of through the direct means of the gun. And what people have to realize is that that debt is money, it is purchasing power that has been filched from them. It's the community's credit, and the community should own that credit. It's income that should have been recognized, allowing the people to acquire what they've been producing as they produce it. In nature, when a product is finished, physically, it has been paid for. The physical and psychological effort, the human effort that's gone into it has been already applied. Everything that is produced and ready to be used has been paid for physically. But we have an enormous, absolutely gargantuan debt that is growing against all of society and their assets.
Thanks, Wally. That's right, and it's excellent that you've brought it to. Really, what you've done is you've brought us to conclusion, because we've gone around talking about policy and administration. We've presented case after case of where the policy through administration is coming down on us, and it's oppressive. And okay, you can talk about bureaucracy, but the biggest bureaucracy of the lot, of course, is the financial system, and that's what controls us all. And we either believe in freedom with responsibility, or we believe in being slaves, because that's what that's how the policy works. The administration is doing it. Now, we're 52 minutes into the recording, and I'm really happy with what we've done today. I'm going to bring it to a close. We're not having a session tomorrow, but I've got another session this afternoon. So I'd like to thank our forum members. We'll be back Wednesday, and just appreciate your contribution today. Wallace Klinck from Canada. Thank you, Wallace.
Very nice to be with you.
And Betty Lukes from Adelaide. Thank you, Betty.
Thank you, Arnie.
Okay, roger that. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of the coolabah tree, as he sat as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Arnie Lukes, info at the Crossroads, signing out. Thank you.